Welcome to our latest installment of ABL Advisors video series featuring thought leaders from the commercial finance industry. I'd like to welcome our guest today, Michael Friedman, the Chief Executive Officer of Hilco IP Merchant Banking. Thanks for being here today, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
I'd like to start right in on the topic of today's discussion, which is about how the current economic environment is impacting the intellectual property finance market. Perhaps the best way to begin this, Michael, is to allow you a few moments just to tell us a little bit about Hilco's IP Merchant Banking and what the mission is of the group.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Hilco IP Merchant Banking is the intellectual property finance and investment arm of Hilco Global. We are the vertical that focuses exclusively around investment and finance edge in intellectual property. Personally, I come from the finance side. I used to run a hedge fund and left that world because believed that sources of alpha in the traditional investing space had become too commoditized. Intellectual property is a brand new world to many people. Many people don't appreciate how to value and how to exploit the value of intellectual property. So it leaves an opportunity for great asymmetrical returns. Very strong upside with, when you properly understand a collateral base, much lower risk than is implied by the coupons or the returns that you can ask for to take that risk.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. I'm going to jump into the actual first question then, if we can, and that is, traditionally, IP assets have been collateralized to raise capital through cash flow or asset-based debt financing. Has the current economic environment impacted the way transactions are secured by IP assets and how those deals are structured today?
So I wouldn't say that the current economic environment has been a material change catalyst. And I would break your question into two parts. Capital raises through cash flow based lending or asset-based debt financing. Cash flow based intellectual property investing is something that is ubiquitous and always seems to be present, whether it's cash flows derived from drug royalties or from music royalties or film royalties. And that market is really overinvested in, overbanked, and frankly, many people believe that's the metes and bounds of what IP collateralized lending is. Where it really gets interesting is on the asset-based side, where you're using intellectual property as the underlying collateral. What is so fascinating about that is because intellectual property is a strange asset, it's a wholly non-commoditized asset by definition. In order to understand the collateral and therefore the quality of an asset-based lending opportunity, you really need to understand the value of the underlying patents. The underlying patents, of course, the value is a function of your ability to assert the negative right, the right to exclude other people from using your technology that's protected by your patent. So at the end of the day, if you have great patents describing great technology that has never been implemented and therefore nobody needs to pay you for using your technology, the value of the asset is next to zero. So one of the most important elements of IP-based or IP asset-based lending is that people truly need to understand the specifics of the collateral that they have and can't generalize a view of what it is worth.
So it's specific to every scenario. You can make no generalization whatsoever in that case, correct?
Specifically, you have to look at technology type, you have to look at sector, you have to look at the potential licensees in the market, you have to look at the quality of the patent portfolio and whether it has patents that are in strong rule of law jurisdictions where you can assert your negative right protections if they're necessary. It's an extremely qualitative, in-depth view. But again, the real advantage of it is that if you do the work and you do the work well, because so much IP collateralized lending is done at very high coupons with extremely low loan to value. So oftentimes 20, 25%. If you've done the hard work and really understand the value of your collateral, you can end up dramatically, in reality, over collateralized for what the market will take you to, or pay you to take an IP risk. So we often like to, say jokingly that IP collateralized lending gives you bond-like risk or bond-like protections in terms of seniority, but equity-like returns. So we consider it really a deep, dark, unexploited secret.
That's interesting. Okay. So in general, how do you feel that the lending market is perceiving the value of IP assets today?
Well, very few lenders will lend against IP. And I can't think of a credit fund that I haven't spoken to about the notion. But, truth be told, very few of them are willing to do the hard work that I described in the previous answer to really get to the collateral value. One way we help facilitate that, and why our business was formed as a merchant bank as opposed to an advisory or investment bank, is that we put principal capital at risk alongside the valuations we do. And that often makes investing much easier for co-investors because we're the purported experts. And if we're prepared to eat our cooking, then it's easy to get them to come along to eat the cooking. It's much more difficult to get any IP collateralized lender to come into the space unless somebody with real IP knowledge is willing to co-invest.
Okay. Now, companies often have portfolios, valuable portfolios of unexploited or perhaps unlicensed patents that can be used as collateral for debt financing. Has the economic environment, what's been going on today, caused companies to take a closer look at their portfolios of IP assets to see if they can leverage those for liquidity?
Well, again, it's not the economic environment that's done it. It's sort of the macro or systemic change in the nature of developed world companies becoming more and more tangible asset light. It isn't as if the companies we see often aren't making an objective decision. Do I want to borrow against my tangible assets or my intangible assets? They don't have tangible assets. They only have intangible assets. And so it's sort of environment agnostic. It's the raw material they have to use. Do I think generally companies that have IP that would be good collateral for loans are looking at their portfolios? Not nearly enough. And a lot of the reason for that is because the DNA of intangible asset rich companies tends to be tech, which means they tended to have their founding around venture and really only understand equity. And so it causes some real important transitional education to begin to get them to think about debt. What happens oftentimes when you introduce a debt conversation, however, to these guys is that they assume that they will have intellectual property assets that have an indeterminate value, most cases because the technology hasn't been implemented or commercialized by anybody, and they'll want to get a loan. And so they're trying to get the lender, and this is the opposite of what I said before, to provide them with debt, although what the source of capital really should be doing is providing equity, given that they have really sort of uncapped risk. The real key to doing IP collateralized finance generally is talking to a company at that inflection point where they go from speculative tangible asset value, in which case they should be doing equity financing, to real concrete tangible or quantifiable value around their intangible assets, where it then can be used as collateral for a loan.
Okay. So okay, well then we talked a little bit then about the fact that this is often in the technology sector, but there's also been a lot published about what's happening with the intellectual property values for the retail sector. Uh, would you like to make any comments as to what's happening in the retail sector or any other sectors beyond technology where IP assets have been impacted and how these transactions are being put together today?
So it's interesting question, because I think a lot of times people use intangible assets or intellectual property assets too generically and think of them as a single asset class. But the way you evaluate the collateral value of a patent is markedly different than how you would a trademark or a brand. So we would really need to answer each of those intangible asset types by market. And I'll be glad to do that if that's where you want to go.
Yeah, maybe you could tell us a little bit about that by some of the markets, some examples.
So let's begin with the patent market. There's a critical turning point that we're experiencing right now. The intellectual property community talks about the intellectual property law as a pendulum. And the pendulum started swinging against patent owners in 2006 in a case called eBay versus Merck Exchange, which limited patent owners' rights to get an injunction when intellectual property infringement was found. Really, in an unceasing swing, the pendulum all the way through this year in 2020 has just piled negative decision upon negative decision on patent owners, really driving patent asset value to a historically low level and certainly the lowest level that we've seen this century. 2020, though, has been a very, very fascinating turning point in the law, not only domestic US law, but international law. And I mean principally the law of Germany, the UK, Japan, China, Taiwan, where for the first time, administrative agencies, legislatures, courts are recognizing that the pendulum has swung too far and that they've enabled licensees to take intellectual property without paying for it. So we've seen a series of decisions come out of legislatures, an important one that came out of the UK Supreme Court, that are finally recognizing that the greater harm is to patent owners than implementers through implementers failing to pay. And I think people are recognizing that the failure by governments to protect intellectual property rights has an important economic consequence. That is, you're seeing a reduction in venture funding and general R&D funding because people have found it harder to protect their rights. These cases that are coming now, I think, are the beginning of the pendulum swinging back. And you'll see a real uptick in the value of quality IP assets going forward. I think the rising tide sunk all boats, but as the tide comes back in, the better boats will rise faster than the less good boats. In the trademark and brand space, the changes to the law have been dramatically less seen, less felt. But the important thing to realize about trademarks and more particularly brands is all the time we see people, there's an incredible glut of brands on the market right now. And we oftentimes see people make assumptions about brand value based on their expectation of historical value. I once was approached by somebody looking for financing against the Compaq brand. And when it was sort of thrown around by the investment committee, it came back. Why would you think that a brand that represented laptop computers the size of a phone book would be attractive going forward? So there's a lot of discrimination that's required in intellectual property, whether it's patents or brands or trademarks. But it's really just the patent market that is seeing real changes today based on changes in the law.
Okay, great. That's a good overview of what's happening in that market from a couple of different aspects. The way I'm going to wrap this up with you, Michael, is just basically I have to ask you for an outlook, and that is, what's your outlook for the IP market as we wrap up 2020 and we move into the new year with the business that you're running today?
Well, again, because of this pendulum swinging back, I think asset values will go up. And I think that that's a good fact, but it's a necessary but not sufficient fact in order to really drive a material amount of IP collateralized lending. What really needs to happen to do that is there needs to be greater understanding on the part of borrowers of what is quality IP and what the variables are around IP portfolio value. And when people become more educated, I think that IP collateralized lending for top portfolios will be done at the same rates as well-known tangible asset portfolios. But it really requires sophisticated lenders to come into this market, take the time to learn the subtleties of the market. But given how many corporations are tending to tangible asset light balance sheets, it's inevitable that this move will come with time.
Okay, thank you. That's a great way to wrap this up, Michael. And with that, I will wrap it up. And I want to thank you for being here today and sharing your thoughts on this marketplace. It's obviously a more complex marketplace. It's one where it requires a certain level of specialty and an understanding of a lot more than what is the traditional asset-based lending market. And I think that we've covered that pretty well today. Is there anything I've left out that you would like to cover in this conversation?
No, but one way we sort of summarize things is we always say there's never a Kelly Blue Book for the value of a patent.
Couldn't find a better way to wrap it up than that. Thanks very much for being here today, Michael. Appreciate your time very much.
Thank you.